everyone. I'm Ray Belli, and this is Words for Granted, a podcast that looks at how words change over time. If you value this podcast as a free and independent educational resource, you can support the show by making a monthly donation at patreon.com/wordsforgranted. Thanks to Matthew, Carrie, Amy, FF, and Oren for their recent contributions. I've recorded an audio version of this month's blog article on the etymology of cockpit, so if you become a contributor, you'll gain access to this latest piece of content in addition to the back catalog of bonus episodes as well. Going forward, I'll be recording all of the monthly articles as podcast episodes for patrons. If you're wondering what blog articles I'm talking about, Words for Granted launched a new and much improved website last month, so go to wordsforgranted.com to check it out, and while you're at it, you can follow the show on Twitter to get Etymology of the Day posts that I've been releasing a few times a week. And with that, on to today's episode, which, by the way, contains explicit language. Words for Granted is usually a squeaky clean, family-friendly experience, but given the subject matter of this interview, rather than prudishly spelling out swear words like shit or fuck, we actually use the words themselves. So if you've ever secretly dreamed that I would use the words shit and fuck on this podcast, today is that day. I hope you enjoy the conversation. Okay, everyone, welcome to today's interview episode of Words for Granted. Joining us is a guest that many of you probably already know and love, linguist and author of the new book, 9 Nasty Words, English in the Gutter, Then, Now, and Forever. John McWhorter. John, thanks for being on the show.
Hi, Ray. Thanks for having me.
So for listeners who aren't familiar with you and your work, can you briefly catch everyone up to speed with what it is you do?
Well, I do a few things, but one of them is that I teach linguistics at Columbia University, and I've written some books about language for the general public, but to me, my real job is teaching linguistics to students and writing academic papers that nobody reads about linguistics, and my specialty within that is language change and language contact. I think on a lot of, like, the t-shirt version is that I study Creole languages, which I do. But in real life, more broadly, I'm interested in just language diachrony and language contact all over the world. So that's roughly what I do.
Got it. So why, given that background, why a book about swearing?
You know, Ray, the answer to that is a little bit cynical, I hate to admit. I had a thought that there are 4 books about language that the general public really wants to read. One of them is about universal grammar. Steve Pinker already wrote that book. One of them is a book saying that language is going to the dogs. Lynn Truss already wrote that book 20 years ago. Gretchen McCullough just got to the one about language and the internet and whether the internet is changing language. There's only one left, and it was one on profanity. And there have been some, but I wanted to kind of get my licks in. And I thought it'll be a way to write a book that people will genuinely enjoy, that will also allow me to get some stealth linguistics lessons across. So that's what 9 Nasty Words is.
I think that's totally fair. I think the linguistics of swearing is sort of in the air. There is that recent Netflix show that came out, which maybe we don't have to get on air talking about it. But I was a little confused about who the audience of that exactly was. It wasn't particularly funny enough for a general audience, I think, and the linguistic content of it wasn't rigorous enough for a language audience, but we can leave it at that. So perhaps let's dig into some of the topics explored in the book. So swears have the guise of ordinary words like shoe, ham, or Harry, or whatever. But when we look at what's going on in our brains when we use swear words, it's actually something different than from what goes on in our brains when we say shoe, ham, or Harry. So what makes swear words different, and what's actually happening in our brains when we swear?
Well, what's interesting about swear words is that if you erupt with a curse, it's actually coming from the right side of the brain, the kind of id, Dionysian side of the brain, as opposed to the left side, which is where most people generate just vanilla language. So if you're quietly putting a sentence together, that's left brain. Right brain is when you yell out F-U-C-K or something like that. And so really it's something that started as a word, like in the case of F-U-C-K, it started as something referring to sexual intercourse. But when you yell it out, you're not saying sexual intercourse. It's not what you mean. It started as that word, but really it's just a yelp. And so that means that we think of these as words that for some reason you're not allowed to use. That's just the thing. They're not really words. They're language used to do something else. They're gestures.
Right. So this sort of gets at this point that I wanted to discuss, which is swears are not universal. And what I mean by that is like there's not an inherently particular set of sounds that is profane. Different languages have different swears, and even within English, we see that the degree of profanity associated with certain words shifts over time. So the power of swearing comes from something else. Where does this come from?
Well, basically, there's an urge to transgress. The idea is that part of being a human being is needing some sort of vehicle, not only linguistically, but in other ways, to do what you're formally not supposed to do. And with English, the way that we do that changes with what we're hung up about. There was blasphemy. Then there was the body. So there's goddamn, and then there's, fuck, shit, and ass, and all of that. And the truth is that around the world, languages can differ as to whether they focus more on the religion or more on the body, or there are other things that you can curse about. So it's often said that Japanese has no curse words. That's kind of true, although not completely true. But the reason is that the way you curse in Japanese is you mess with the difference between, even in English, we could barely get it across. But if it were Spanish, between tu and usted. If it was French, between tu and vous. Except in Japanese, that sort of thing is much richer and more complicated. Playing with that is the way you transgress in Japanese and connote the same flavor that we do with, get your fucking hands off of me or something like that. So that's the idea. And today, of course, for us, what has become curse words is slurs, because we're more concerned with that, most of us, than God or what comes out of our body.
Right. So I think we can say that the power of swearing comes from culture and perhaps more specifically taboos within the culture. And the specificity of the taboo may change, but the cultural presence of taboo is ever present, always has been, always will be. Is that right?
Exactly. Yeah. This is humanity.
Right. So it might surprise some people to learn that in the Middle Ages, words like fuck, shit, cock, and the other C word were not actually obscene. And that's because the things that these words represent were actually much more on display, literally, than they are today. I think it's in the 16th century when we start to have innovations around privacy, like private
15,
bedrooms.
Right. Yeah.
15. Excuse me. That's why I qualified that with I think.
Yeah, that was good. Yeah, it's an interesting thing to read things written in English, say before the 1500s, and certainly say the 11 and the 1200s, where you find that those things that we now consider profane, they're considered salty. They're something that you snicker at, but they're not profane. They're not something you don't put down on paper. People were much more honest about those things, as you say, partly because there was less privacy. There was some privacy, but more happened out in the open, or practically out in the open, in medieval life than we can imagine. And so you have, for example, people walking around taking themselves seriously with names like Roger Fuck by the Navel and Henry Fuckbutter. And these things were actually on paper and not like in the caption to some supposedly humorous drawing where that's the name of some clown. These are ordinary people doing ordinary things. And you would have a street called Grope Cunt Lane. And once again, maybe people laughed a little bit, but the funny thing is there was more than one Grope Cunt Lane. This was just the way things went. And then starting in the 14 and then especially the 1500s, you start seeing words like fuck go underground. And next thing you know, those words are treated as sacred as actual sacred words, such as how you treat God and Jesus and hell.
Yeah, I think for me, the most, and this is certainly a nerdy fascination, but I find it fascinating that the clinical words for our genitals, penis and vagina, these are Latin derived, while most of our other body parts are Germanic. And I've talked about this on Words for Granted a lot. And this is because, common words like body parts, pronouns, basic verbs, etc., these tend to be Germanic because English is fundamentally a Germanic language. Basic vocabulary within a language tends to be conservative, resisting change over time, etc. And I actually don't know what the Old English words for penis and vagina were, but when
pintle, and then whatever their word for sheath was, which I forget. They were very neutral words. Anyway, go ahead.
So when these Latinate words, penis and vagina, came in to replace the native English terms, they were euphemisms, right? To sort of elevate them and make them less vulgar.
And so here we are with this weird situation where, say, penis and vagina are kind of clinical. You immediately think of a linoleum floor and, too much light in the room. But then the words like, dick and the other ones are way low down, and there's nothing really in between, or you really have to think hard about it. That's an English thing. That's partly a Western post-Reformation thing, that we don't have just good, honest words that nobody would laugh at for those. So there's arm, or take hand. And somebody might say, get your mitts off of that person. Then someone might say, well, he had manual extremities. Then we have hand. We don't have words like that for the down there parts. It's either gutter or clinical. And that's because of our hang up about those things.
Well, let's talk about the word swear itself, like why we use this term, where it comes from, and how it relates to damn and hell, which today are barely profane, but at one point in the history of English, damn and hell would have been in the league of fuck and dare I say cunt. So yeah, tell us about this, where swearing comes from and how it relates to damn and hell.
Yeah, why we call it swearing. We're kind of used to the idea that there's this word that means curse, which is to swear, and you think vaguely you can say, I swear to God, but is that exactly cursing? What that is that at first, the whole idea was the sincerity with which you swear to God. If you're going to swear to God, you're supposed to really mean it, but you're not supposed to take it lightly. If you swear to God, or you swear to Jesus, or you swear to anybody about something trivial and you don't really mean it, that was considered a sinful thing. So swearing was short for swearing in vain, which of course people did because people transgress. But the idea was that the way you transgress is to say, oh my God, too lightly. Hence, you have all sorts of euphemisms that we still use, barely thinking of them as connected to those things. Jeepers Creepers is Jesus Christ. G is Jesus. Then there are the funny old ones like zounds for by his wounds. All of those were ways of doing it without doing it, just like some people today say shoot for shit. So yeah, cursing starts out with that, which to most of us now seems so quaint, but in a time when writing was so rare. We see Old English, for example, in writing, and so we think that's the language. For most people, Old English was something that was only spoken. There was no such thing as school, no such thing as media. You probably couldn't read. It was a language that most people just experienced as something in mouths and ears. If that's true, the way you sign something is to swear to it. It meant something to swear because there was no way for you to put your name to paper because, frankly, usually there wasn't any paper. So that's why they took the swearing so seriously. To us, it looks quaint. But that's why cursing is called, in what started as a kind of shorthand, swearing.
So this is like you could call it like a performative act of signature.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Performative act of signature. That's good.
Oh, thank you. This also brings to mind that the etymology of profane also has a religious lineage as well. It comes from, in Latin, pro means outside and fanum means the temple and or place of worship or whatever. So what was profane was things that were appropriate to do outside of church or outside your place of worship,
but not in it, right?
But not in it. So there's a connection between, or specifically a religious connection between these words, profane, and swearing. So in the book, you mention how we use the word hell as a scalar particle, and some listeners may not know what that is, and that's not really the point that I want to get at. The point I want to get at is profanities are often grammaticalized in creative ways that defy sense or meaning. And the semantics of the way that we use a lot of swear words are ambiguous. And that's because you point out swearing doesn't necessarily serve a strictly semantic purpose, but a pragmatic purpose. So break this down for us. What is the difference between semantics and pragmatics, and what does this have to do with swearing?
Well, pragmatics is a very unfortunate name. It's a sad label because for real people, pragmatic means practical. And what pragmatics refers to is that there are aspects of a language that aren't about what you're referring to, but how you feel about it, what sort of feeling you're trying to convey, what sort of attitude there is, and subtler things like that. And so, for example, there is totally, if you say she's totally going to call you, what that means is not she's going to call you completely. She's totally going to call you means you and I know that she is going to call you, even if some people who are not us would be inclined to think not. She's totally going to call. We know, they don't. You don't think about it, but that's what totally means. That's not about meaning. That larger implication about what may or may not be going on between the two of you, that's pragmatics. Even in the sense of I'd even play the maid in that play is also pragmatic in usage. And one way you know you're dealing with pragmatics is when you would have a hard time explaining to a foreigner what it meant. So we all know how to use even. You know, in that play, I want to be in that play so badly, I'd even play the maid. But imagine somebody asks you, excuse me, but you said even? Even? What is this even? What is it? And imagine how hard it would be. I don't know what accent that was, but how hard it would be to explain to that person what it meant. And whatever it meant, notice this. I want to be in that play so much that I'd even play the maid. That's sentence number one. Now, sentence number two. I want to be in that play so much, hell, I'd play the maid. Notice that the hell sentence means the exact same thing as the even sentence. That's because in both cases, you're saying I would play the lead, but I would play the second lead. I would play the comic relief. You know, it would go so far as me playing the maid. There are two ways of saying that. I'd even play the maid, and hell, I'd play the maid. And that means that hell, which starts out referring to this place that supposedly most of us are going to go, now that has become a piece of grammar. That has become something that means the same thing as pasty, little even. That's how, this is what I mean by the stealth linguistics. That's how language change happens, that something can go from meaning Hades to meaning this final one of a stepwise, extreme kind of possibilities.
Right. And I mean, I think this is the best example of this in the book is you provide this humorous, to me, humorous hypothetical chart of future English where ass is an adjectival suffix. So what is your thinking there?
That actually could happen if people would just leave English alone. You say something like, oh, I'm going to get out a big ass pot and it's going to be for spaghetti. And you think to yourself, that means that the pot is very large. But that's not what that usage of ass means, because the one I use, I think, in the book, and which is useful, is imagine you have an overnight guest. That person gets up earlier than you, and you walk into your kitchen and they're looking out the kitchen window and they say, hey, look, it's a gray ass squirrel. Now, if they say that the squirrel is a gray ass squirrel, first of all, it has nothing to do with how gray the squirrel is. The person doesn't mean that squirrel's really gray, which if you think about it, wouldn't mean anything anyway, and yet it's a plausible sentence. If they said, oh, look, it's a gray ass squirrel, you would know instantly this person comes from somewhere where squirrels are not usually gray. You would instantly know, okay, this must be somebody who comes from where squirrels are white or something, because he's saying gray ass, and what he means is gray unexpectedly. And so big ass pot doesn't mean that the pot is very big. It means not just that medium-sized pot you might think. Get something bigger than you're expecting. Get a big ass pot. That it's so subtle, and it's not very, that you can imagine a language going on into the future. And because it's subtle and you don't have conscious access to what it means, and it can be taken to mean just the adjective itself, you can have a language where this adjectival suffix was just there on any adjective. Many languages have an adjectival suffix, and ours would be this ass. And an etymologist would say, well, you know, that goes back to what was originally buttocks. And people would say, well, who'd have thunk it? That's interesting ass, or something like that. That could be the way it goes.
Right. And, you know, this is probably exactly the way that like became the adverbial suffix, ly. That's
what in the world is it doing there? It starts out meaning body, and now it's just this little ly, just step by step by step.
Right. Okay, this is sort of a non sequitur, but do you have a preferred past tense of shit?
I I really, for me, it's a gap. Because take a shit to me is crude, shat is a joke, and shitted is wrong. And so, no, whatever are you getting at?
I was just thinking about this myself, and I think I'm in the shat camp. I think I use shat seriously. I do use the phrase "take a shit" and would certainly say "took a shit" or "will take a shit." But yeah, shat somehow seems legitimate to me.
I always think of it as sort of a neologism, which it was about 200 years ago. It started as kind of a little trick, but yes, it has become accepted. Yeah.
Yeah, I think I just selfishly wanted John McWhorter's take on the past tense shat.
It's well, here's one for you. Sneaking. If you did it yesterday, what did you do?
I snuck.
Not sneaked?
No, I would say snuck.
Okay, people vary on that. I like snuck too.
Yeah,
there are
okay.
people who will swear about sneaked. So I just wondered where you fell on that one too.
Well, which is the more conservative of those two?
Sneaked. It's changing to snuck. Yeah.
Okay.
There are holdouts. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm a snuck guy. Great. Well, maybe we can wrap up by discussing slurs. I want your take on this sociological phenomenon where you have a denigrated or offended group who's called a particular slur, and then they actually reclaim the slur as a way of referring to each other. Women calling each other bitch, gay men calling each other a certain F word, African Americans calling each other the N word, Quakers calling each other Quakers, which no one really finds offensive anymore. But that did begin as an offensive slur, a derisive term.
I forgot about that. Yep, that's right. Yeah.
So why might a denigrated group appropriate that slur when that slur is used against them?
Well, part of becoming intimate is that you lower yourself. Intimacy requires that neither one of you thinks of yourself as higher. And so that's why, around the world, and I'm making this up, but I would die on this hill. Around the world, especially men becoming friends, the ceremony will involve engaging in some sort of intoxicant or doing some sort of dance or something where both of you show that you're just ordinary people. And so that happens in language too, where there's going to be this impulse for people to call each other something that's slightly dismissive as a form of affection, because what it means is you're close to me, I'm comfortable with you. So around the world, there are things that men say to each other that are dismissive from the outside, but from the inside, it's okay. In Russian, a mujik is technically, some dirty peasant. Guys will call each other mujik, and that means you're my friend. So the same thing happened with the N-word. And the only question almost would have been why it hadn't. And what makes that complicated in the United States is, first of all, that because we all think language is in the dictionary, there's this idea that Black men are using the same word as some Southern racist 50 years ago, when you could argue that really they are different words that happen to have the same shape because they came from the single one word. Then in the United States, what gets majestically complicated is that, of course, on race, we're not there, but we've made some progress, enough that now there's been a generation of non-Black guys who have grown up feeling connected enough to Black culture, especially through hip hop, that they want to use that word too to mean buddy to each other. And of course, from the outside, that looks very racist. They feel like they're just saying buddy to each other, and they figure if rappers can do it and Black guys can do it, why can't we do it? Because there's a part of us that's Black too, because we like Black people. And this is all very superficial progress, but there's something to it, and it makes that word really, really confusing.
Yeah. So then what's the verdict? If a group is using a slur to refer to other members of that group affectionately, it does or does not grant outsiders of that group fair usage. What's the verdict there?
No, I think part of being an American of any sophistication is to understand it's different when Black men are doing it. It doesn't mean that a white person can do it addressing a Black person. Now, as I say in the book, it's very hard for me as a linguist and cultural commentator to straddle this, because the linguist only describes. And so what I know is that I hear white guys using that word with one another, not knowing that I can hear, and that there's a little issue with that. And I think to myself, that happened. And it's not my job to think, how I feel about it. The other part of me thinks, and to tell you the truth, I get it. I can imagine being that white guy saying that and really feeling like it meant buddy, and he's lived the hip hop. I get him. I am not a kind of Black person who's inclined to think that he's a racist, but boy, do they need to keep that quiet. That's something I would really rather they do in their own rec rooms, if there's still a such thing as that. You don't do that walking down the street. But as a linguist, what I know is that is done, and I just leave it there.
Yeah, fair enough. I've heard this myself, and it strikes me as somewhere between offensive and just odd. Just
Yes,
odd.
Exactly.
Well, great. This has been a wonderful conversation. Great to have you, John. Before you go, plug away. Where can people find you, get in contact with you, etc.?
You can find 9 Nasty Words anywhere. You can find me at my email at Columbia. Or also, if you want a crankier, less palatable side of me, you can read my Substack newsletter, which I started doing a few months ago. But for the sunnier side of me, listen to my podcast, Lexicon Valley, where basically I do this. And there is also, what's the other thing? Oh, and I write for The Atlantic, usually on language or race issues. So there are a bunch of places that I am. And Lexicon Valley is not ending in June. I'll announce for the first time here that Lexicon Valley is actually going to keep going. And so, yeah, listen in, and we'll be talking about all sorts of things on that show.
All right. Well, fantastic. Thanks again, John.
Thank you, Ray, for having me.